We're here today to commemorate something I think very important. But first of all, I have to speak to you about the readings for the Mass today. The first reading tells us there are some limits that we face in life that we should not try to exceed, that they're not meant to be exceeded, and that these particular limits, when we live within them, are simply going to give us the freedom that we need to serve God and to do it well. On the other hand, the message of the second reading is that there are some limits that need to be exceeded. What's that about? Well, the second reading from Paul to Philemon is really the shortest book of the New Testament, and it can help to know something about the context of that particular reading. We think that St. Paul was an old man at the time that he wrote this. He says so in the book itself. He is sending his servant Onesimus to Philemon with a letter. Now that seems innocuous enough until you understand that Onesimus was the slave of Philemon and ran away from him. Essentially, he stole Philemon's property. So imagine you being in that position, getting St. Paul to tell you, here's a letter, please deliver this to your former owner. Now, how are you going to feel about that, huh? Not necessarily very good. And Philemon, we don't know anything about him. We don't even know how this story ended. But imagine if you were Philemon and Onesimus came back and handed you that letter, and St. Paul was telling you, if you value your friendship with me and your faith in Jesus Christ, treat this man as your brother. That's a limit that needs to be exceeded, don't you think? Now, one of the things from my mind, anyway, about the saints is that they show us that there are limits in life that we take for granted, that we don't ever try to exceed. We don't even give ourselves the opportunity to, until we see that it can be done in the saints. Now, before Mass began, one of the sisters came to me in the sacristy and said, I'd like you to know there's someone here tonight. Her name is Mabel Gomes, who was with Mother Teresa when she started her missionary work in India. That would have been a very long time ago. Let me give you just a few dates here about Mother Teresa. She was born in 1910. She went to Ireland, of all places, in 1928 to become a nun, a sister of Loreto. In 1929, she went to India, where she was, I think, a teaching sister, if I remember that correctly. And she had her own epiphany, her own desire to do something for the poor, which manifested itself in 1946. In 1950, she received permission from the Vatican to begin her own religious order, which is now, I think, the largest religious order of women in the world. In 1979, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. Here's a little bit of trivia. It may not do much for you, but I'm going to say it anyway. In their lifetime, there were only 2 people who received honorary American citizenship while they were still alive. One of them was Winston Churchill, and the other was Mother Teresa. In 1997, she died. However, before that, in 1995, in June, she was in Atlanta. Now, I'm going to tell you the story. I promised Sister that I would say some of these things which I have never said before. So you're hearing this after 21 years. I hadn't been pastor at Sacred Heart very long. In fact, it was less than a year. And I got a call one day from Archbishop Donahue, And he said, "Steve, I want you to do me a favor." Now, when an archbishop speaks that way, you tend to listen. And I said, "Oh, what can I do for you, Archbishop?" And he said, "Mother Teresa is coming to Atlanta for the blessing of the gift of Grace House, and she'd like to have a public mass at Sacred Heart." And I said, "Well, that's wonderful. That's such a great honor for us. I'll start a committee so that we can begin the planning process, and we'll begin to put the resources together that will help this be a wonderful celebration. By the way, when is she coming?" And he said, "In 10 days. So in that sense, I think that was a test for me. One of the things that happened was that on June 4th, we had an article appear in the Atlanta paper that talked about this visit, but some of the things that didn't get seen were that the State Department treated Mother Teresa as a foreign dignitary. There were bomb-sniffing dogs in the church. There was a discussion that I had with somebody who, from the State Department, said, "We need to surround Mother Teresa with people who could be a living shield." Well, think of that for a moment, huh? So to the 150 people who were parishioners at the time that I gave tickets to so that they could have a seat in the church, guess what? You were a living shield. Now, another thing that happened was that some of the sisters at the Gift of Grace House had never had the opportunity to meet Mother Teresa. And believe me, when she came, this place was a madhouse. The church was full, the galleries were full, there were thousands of people on the street outside. So we got Mother in and put her into the back room where at the time there was a reception area for the priests, a kind of living room, you might say. And I put the sisters there and Mother Teresa there and left them something to eat and to drink, and I shut the door, and I put a policeman in front of the door. And that didn't stop everyone, huh? So I stood in front of the door because I thought it was important that the sisters have an opportunity to meet Mother Teresa, the ones that had never met her before. So remember what I said about what the readings talk to us about today. The first reading tells us there are limits that we should not try to go beyond. The second reading tells us there are some limits we should try to exceed. So when we see the saints, and by the way, I want to say something here. The church doesn't make saints. What happens is the church solemnly recognizes the fact that someone is a saint. Now, having said that, I simply want to say that in my opinion, and it's not a humble one, I'm very, very convinced about this. When we see a saint, we see that limits can be exceeded. We see that there are ways that we can love God better and serve God better. We may not be called to be heroic in our virtues or live the kind of life that Mother Teresa did, but we are called to understand that it can be done. And whether someone else does it for us or we do it for ourselves, we need to thank God not only for that person, but for the example that they give us. And so these, because I also made a solemn promise when I came here not to preach beyond 7 minutes, are my thoughts tonight. And I would like to conclude this way. Saint Teresa of Calcutta, pray for us.